There's been a recent increase in hate crime bills around the world. Scotland implemented one, the United States are looking to implement it, and a lot of free speech advocates are saying that free speech around the world is under attack. It's been very interesting to watch hate speech bills going throughout Scotland, where now there are people being interviewed under caution for sending mean tweets, which potentially say things like, there's only two genders. So the hate speech laws really have kind of progressed in Western society. It was with that in mind that as South Africans, we were very upset to see the introduction or the tabling of a hate speech bill in South Africa. The bill was originally produced some time ago, and it was put through on DRSA and other platforms for public comment. But it was interesting to note that yesterday the Deputy Justice Minister, John Jeffrey, said that the bill was still necessary in South Africa. Ramon, what's your views on the bill?
Well, I think we need to understand where it comes from. So it's called the Prevention and Combating of Hate Crimes and Hate Speech. This came off about after, what's her name? Penny Sparrow. Remember, like in 2016, when the ANC needed a scapegoat for its own failures, it put it on some estate agents in the KZN somewhere who called people on the beach monkeys because they littered. And she was basically, that basically killed her because she died not too long afterwards of certain illnesses, which were no doubt exacerbated by the utter frenzy of the mob.
Or going to prison in South Africa is not exactly a piece of cake, is it?
Yeah, well, she didn't. I mean, she had to pay 150,000 rand and all that sort of nonsense. So this bill was a consequence of that. And now what the government wants to do is not to, they can't ban racism, but they want to make sure that for any racism that is, wait a minute, sorry, wrong one.
So basically what they're trying to do is decriminalize racism. So they note that in the Constitution there is a provision against freedom of speech, but that freedom of speech is limited by the freedom of expression for propaganda of war, incitement of imminent violence, advocacy of hatred based on a race, ethnicity, gender, and religion. And the Justice Department does, obviously underneath the existing framework, the correct way to deal with those are to go before the Equality Court. The Equality Court will look at the speech and determine whether it was hateful. And then once the Equality Court has deemed whether it's hateful, it's down to the MPA to deem whether it should be prosecutable in the criminal courts. So to give you a recent example of where this happened, we have the Kill the Boer song, which was deemed by the Equality Court to be hate speech. It was then privately prosecuted because the MPA refused to prosecute it on its own merits. It was privately prosecuted by AfriForum, and then the High Court determined that it wasn't hate speech and that it was actually a song
that means
referenced in historical context.
Just be careful. It wasn't the High Court, it was the Equality Court itself, which is basically a kangaroo court. Let's be honest. It has no great merits to itself. So now they want to create this hate speech bill where if you commit racism, you go to jail. Right, for now, there's fines and things like this, but now you go to jail for being racist. So I thought, interesting. Let's see, what do people say about it? The so-called experts on this. And interestingly, the former head of the Human Rights Commission, called Bwang Jones, who said a lot of things were racist that weren't, he says racism should be punished and racists should be jailed because he said racism is a defining feature of our country and for much of our history as well. And as a state policy, racial discrimination was lawful and well-resourced for over a century. And even to this day, racists are emboldened and therefore we need to jail them. Byron, is there something there that strikes you as a bit odd?
There is something there that strikes me as odd, and it's very interesting that a similar, should we say, thought was echoed by Deputy Justice Minister John Jeffrey when he said, and again we're going to quote, racism is a complex problem. We're not going to resolve racism until we resolve the racial nature of poverty and power in South Africa. But we did feel as government that it is important to have penalties for racism and other intolerances. But it's not meant to be the sole answer. It's just one of the aspects. So I suppose the nature of what he's saying and what the former head of the Human Rights Commission is saying comes down to basically racial poverty, and now we all know what they basically mean as the black underclass, and the power structures in South Africa, which they still continue to deem to be a white thing. So as far as both are really kind of concerned, and this is where my first concern with the bill comes in, racism can only occur in one way. It can only be a white being racist to a black. If a black is racist to a white, well, that's just historical injustices and they're fighting against oppression.
Yeah, I mean, my answer was, if you look at the word racists, you just change the word to mean white people. You just replace it. It'll mean exactly the same thing in the 100%. Context in which they are speaking it. So when Wong Jones or John Jeffries, who happens to be white, whatever his name is, says that when racists should be jailed and when racists continue to undermine the aspirations of our nation based on human dignity, they're talking about white people, no one else.
100%.
Only
100%.
white people. And that is 100%. The first problem with this bill, is that it's going to be used to target white people because it's in the very definition of their term racist.
100%. So it's interesting to note that obviously, even if you look at it in a historical context, if we called a black individual by the K word, you and I would both be off to the gulags. But white people getting called umlungu on a daily basis is like, it's just part and parcel of it. Other people end up calling white people gammon, and it's like, who cares? But there's we all know that this is what happens with intersectionality. There always becomes a racial hierarchy of repressed minorities. And despite the balance of powers being with a majority or a predominantly overwhelming majority black government, apparently the white people still hold the power structure, even though they hold none of the levers of power in society.
Yep.
So, but we know that when they talk about things like, economic deprivation, we know that the government feels that the only people that can be poor in the country are black. Even if a white person lives in a squatter camp, they're still subject to some form of systemic privilege, which I actually think goes on in the explainer you're drawing reference to. They do actually draw reference to systemic racism.
Yeah, no, they do. So just before we go there, though, Mark Oppenheimer was also interviewed as an expert. And he actually is one. Mark Oppenheimer is a good friend of the show, an advocate. And he says, there will be a danger in criminalizing racism as those who are in power will decide on what counts as racism. And that is exactly the point we were making in less eloquent terms. When the ANC decides what racism is, that's the hammer, and all of us who are white or who are not black will be the nails.
Correct. Now the natural kind of pushback that we're going to get is we're going to get people go, yeah, but Ramon, Byron, you're both white and you're racist. Like, how dare you say these things? Don't you understand the racial repression that people are getting? And we understand it perfectly well, and we understand and we sympathize. However, that's not what we're seeing around the world. Let's not forget that in the United States, whiteness is deemed to be a thing. And whiteness is deemed to be anything that revolves around capitalism, or traditional families, in other words, the nuclear family, the belief in Protestant worth ethics. Those things are now deemed to be whiteness. So what happens when you have a communist government that basically believes that your property rights shouldn't be your own? Right? That's a distinctly capitalistic idea. It's a distinctly Western idea. It's a distinctly liberal idea. Well, if I say, no, my house is my own and I've got title to it, is that whiteness? And does that classify as racism? Or if I turn around and say, well, I have a nuclear family and there should just be a mother and a father, is that whiteness? That's racism? Because there is no shortage of articles online that seek to make that argument. That argument is being made right now today. So it's not a hypothetical, is it?
No, it isn't. And we've seen articles where, like, going outside is like racist, right? Or like having a walk in nature, like a hike, is racist. So I mean, a lot of these things are racist to some of us. And who knows, the ANC might look at these people who write these sort of articles and be like, yeah, I mean, maybe hunting is racist because it's only done by white people. So therefore, hunting is a form of hate speech. Like, who knows? That's obviously a ridiculous example.
But this is where it goes.
Ridiculous now. In 5 years, we'll be like, geez, of course hunting's racist. What are we thinking?
Yeah. And, it's funny because we can all say this and we can all be like, yeah, this would never happen. But then people never thought that, sending a private meme around George Floyd and making jokes on it would result in police officers getting fined and sent to prison But this happened in the United Kingdom. There is a case, a very well-known case, where a British police officer was found underneath their hate speech codes, and all he did was share. He didn't even create it. He just shared a meme that basically said George Floyd was a drug addict, and he went to prison. So, and he went there as it was deemed to be racist. So don't negatively just dismiss these things.
Like, even things that are true are considered racist. Like, George Floyd was 100%. A drug addict. Like, he had like 20 fentanyl tablets in his blood system or something when he was killed. I mean, murdered, whatever you want to call it. So yeah, at the end of the day, in Britain, it's sort of, hate speech is done in this material way where police come up to you and talk to you and drag you to prison. In South Africa, that's not going to happen the same way, my friends. They're going to have a list of people that they don't like. They say, oh, Adam Schultz tweeted this. It's definitely racist. We're only going to target him. And we're going to send police officers after him. No one else, right? It's going to be scattered. It's going to be chaotic. But this law gives the power for the ANC to determine what's racist. B, that only whites can be racist. And C, now we can jail people for speaking truthful things.
But Ramon, that would never happen. So yeah, and I hear the audience saying that right now. Except in 1929, the Germans introduced, underneath the Weimar Republic, a legislation which required gun registration, firearm registration. Everybody said, yeah, but what's wrong with firearm registration? You just register your firearm. If you've got nothing to hide, like, what's the harm? So the government determined what was allowed, who was allowed to own it, and for what purposes, because you gave the government that power. And everybody was like, okay, we'll use it for self-defense and you go hunting. I mean, what's the big deal, right? Except nobody thought in their right mind that the Nazis would come to power and use that data for something malicious. And they did. When the Nazis came to power, their first rule was, they said, oh, there was too much infighting between the communists. We need to take the communists and disarm them. But they already knew who the communists were because they had a list. So they already knew who to disarm. Funnily, that list also then turned to the Jews, and we all know what happened to the Jews. So allowing the government to take these forms of power does have a way of mutating to serve the government when the government wishes to be authoritarian. It's better not to give the government those forms of powers. So bills like this are just a terrible idea. It's just a terrible idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a terrible idea if it works both ways, right? So if Malema goes to jail for racism, which he has uttered on numerous occasions, then I'll be like,
which we won't know he won't.
Maybe, but we know for sure he's not going to, right?
Yes.
Just as like the law doesn't apply when he shoots a firearm in public, just as when the law doesn't apply when he had entrepreneur scandals in Limpopo all those years ago, the law doesn't apply to people in power in South Africa, but they're going to make laws that gives them more power to screw us over. And this is exactly what it is. And this is particularly to screw over white South Africans.
Yeah, and it's interesting because if you recall, and I know you'll recall better than me because you followed the case better than I do, but you may recall that there wasn't that long ago where the Human Rights Commission were asked questions about racism, and they did say that actually only whites can really be racist because of their racial privilege and because of their historical privilege. Like black people, you know, it's like historical and they didn't have power, and so racist people black people can't be racist, which is exactly why we're saying a form of legislation like this won't go both ways. It will be used by the government to oppress minorities. It will be used, and I'm not going to even say minorities, I'm going to say anybody who doesn't agree with them. Anybody who doesn't go along with it, like, it's going to get classed as whiteness, the same way we see any Democrat or Republican who's black, who then goes along and says, yeah, but I don't agree with the current thing. They're all classed as being white. So it's like your black skin can be taken off you and you can deem to be white, and you can have whiteness because of the things that you believe, like whether or not you believe in free market enterprise and private property. So giving the government those kind of powers, it's just a really bad move.
Yeah, sorry, Brian, your mic did crackle a bit there. I'm not too sure why. Maybe it's the smog in Kabuki land. But I think we get the point. This is a bill that's ostensibly designed to weaponize racists, i.e. whites, and to make sure that they're not allowed to have free speech. That's all this bill is about. We can talk about whether it's necessary or not. I don't give a shit. If you look at what the actual people who are writing the bill say about it, it's there to solve racism. And for them, racism equals white people. It is as simple as that. So, yeah, I don't know where it's going to go from here. They want to get it done as soon as possible, according to Parliament. So, yeah, by the time you see this video, we might be in jail for hate speech. Who knows? Just because we made this video.
It's very, very possible. I mean, if you look at it, the bill was tabled in 2018 and went on the back burner for some time, and all of a sudden, everybody's got their knickers in a twist and they want to push it through Parliament at the speed of light. You could also notice that elections are coming through in 2024, and it's very likely that the ANC are going to get a hiding. And it's also very likely that as we get closer to 2024, more people will start to criticize the national government. And things like hate speech bills are a great way for the government to silence its detractors. If you were a cynical person, you could say the two are connected. But Roman, you and me, we're not cynical people, right?
Cynicism on Morning Shot? Never. Never. We are all about hopes and dreams and aspirations and the homecoming revolution. But there you go. That's the news for today. Thanks for watching, everyone. And have yourself a wonderful weekend, because it is Friday, which is the first Saturday of the week. Anyway, whatever. Byron, have a good weekend. You have a good weekend.
And you.
Have a good one. Cheers.
Bye.